There is a law in military engineering that nobody writes down but every procurement officer knows. The machine that looks right, sleek, fast, and modern gets funded. The machine that looks wrong gets laughed out of the room. And yet, again and again, the ugliest hardware on the battlefield outlasts and outperforms the equipment it was never supposed to beat. Beauty in a weapon usually means compromise. Ugliness more often means the engineer solved the real problem and refused to smooth the edges. What follows are 10 military machines so ugly that the people who built them struggled to get them approved, and so effective that they changed the wars they fought in. Number 10. Kettenkrad, Germany, 1943. Part motorcycle, part tank, and entirely absurd, the Kettenkrad was a German answer to a question nobody else thought to ask. What if a motorcycle had tank tracks? The vehicle was barely 10 feet long and weighed about 1.5 tons. It had a conventional motorcycle front end with handlebars and a single wheel, but the rear half rode on continuous tracks driven by a small Opel engine. It looked like a cartoon, but the German army built more than 8,000 of them. On the Eastern Front, where roads turned to mud every spring and fall, the Kettenkrad became indispensable. It towed trailers, laid signal cable, carried ammunition, and moved personnel where wheeled vehicles could not go. Paratroopers used it. Desert units used it. Airfield crews used it to tow aircraft in conditions that would have buried ordinary trucks. It was ugly, awkward, and exactly right for the job. Number 9. Vespa 150 TAP, French Indochina, 1956. A scooter with a recoilless rifle bolted to the handlebars should not exist, and yet the Vespa 150 TAP did. Designed for French paratroopers fighting in Algeria, it carried an American M2075mm recoilless rifle mounted between the bars. The gun could penetrate significant armor at useful ranges, while the scooter itself weighed only a few hundred pounds fully loaded. The concept was speed and surprise. 2 scooters would be dropped together by parachute, one carrying the gun and the other carrying ammunition plus crew. The unit could assemble quickly and engage armor or fortifications before conventional anti-tank weapons arrived. It was ridiculous on sight and effective enough that France built several hundred and used them operationally. The lesson was simple. Absurd and useless are not the same thing. Number 8. PBY, Catalina, North Atlantic, 1940. The PBY Catalina was long, slow, and shaped like a flying pregnant pelican. It had a wingspan of more than 100 feet, 2 Pratt & Whitney radial engines, and a cruise speed that made it look helpless next to fighters. Crews called it the pig boat, and it was one of the most important patrol aircraft of the Second World War. More than 3,000 were built. They served in every theater. A Catalina spotted the German battleship Bismarck after the Royal Navy had lost contact, helping set up its destruction. At Midway, Catalinas found the Japanese carrier force and gave American commanders the warning that made the battle possible. Painted black as night hunters, they prowled Pacific sea lanes. As rescue aircraft, they landed on open water under fire and pulled downed airmen out of the ocean. It was too ugly to love and too useful to replace. Number 7. Fairy Swordfish, Taranto and the Atlantic, 1940 to 1941. The Swordfish was an open cockpit biplane with fabric-covered wings and a top speed that looked laughable even in 1940. The Italians at Taranto were not worried about being attacked by a plane that looked out of date before the First World War had ended. That mistake cost them dearly. In November 1940, Swordfish torpedo bombers launched from HMS Illustrious struck the Italian fleet at anchor and crippled several battleships. Months later, a Swordfish torpedo jammed the rudder of the Bismarck and sealed the ship's fate. Its secret was its slowness. Anti-aircraft fuses often misjudged it because it flew so far below modern speed expectations. The biplane survived the jet age long enough to sink a battleship. Number 6. M3. Lee, North Africa, 1942. The M3. Lee looked like a mobile apartment building. It stood tall, nearly 3 feet taller than the German Panzer IV, with a 75mm gun mounted in a side sponson and a smaller turret on top. Its armor was riveted, not welded, which meant a direct hit could send metal fragments flying through the crew compartment. British crews called it a coffin, and yet it was the only Allied tank in North Africa in 1942 with a gun big enough to fight German armor at range. At Gazala, Grant and Lee tanks used their 75mm guns to knock out panzers from distances where the Germans could not answer effectively. The M3 was a stopgap, never intended to be elegant. It kept the line intact until the Sherman arrived. Sometimes the ugliest vehicle in the battle is the one that shows up when nothing else can. Number 5. Landing Craft Tank, Normandy, 1944. The LCT was a flat-bottomed steel box with a ramp. It had little armor, little speed, and no grace. In rough water it rolled horribly, and the men inside spent much of the crossing seasick or worse. But that was not its purpose. Its job was to drive onto a beach, drop its ramp, and unload tanks directly onto the sand. On D-Day, LCTs delivered the armor that helped crack the German defenses. Hundreds were built in many sizes and treated as expendable. They were damaged, lost, and replaced in the same spirit as cargo containers. They won by being in the right place at the right time with the thing that mattered most. Number 4. IL-2 Sturmovik, Eastern Front, 1941. The IL-2 was built like a Soviet tractor, heavy, simple, and made in huge numbers. Its cockpit and engine were wrapped in armor that was also part of the load-bearing structure. It was the first aircraft in history where the armor was not added to the airframe, but was the airframe. That made it tough. It also made it slow and ungainly. German pilots called it the concrete bomber. Soviet infantry called it the flying tank. More than 36,000 were built, more than any other military aircraft in history. At Kursk, IL-2s helped devastate German armor with rockets, bombs, and cannon fire. Early single-seat versions suffered horrific losses, but the Soviets could build replacements faster than the Germans could destroy them. The IL-2 did not win by elegance. It won by arithmetic. Number 3. Royal Navy monitors, First and Second World Wars. Monitors were naval oddities, small hulls carrying oversized guns. The idea was to float the biggest possible weapon on the cheapest possible platform. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror carried 15-inch guns on hulls only a few hundred feet long. They were slow, rolled badly, and took water over the deck in anything but calm seas. But they could sit off a coast and bombard targets with battleship-level firepower for a fraction of the cost of a battleship. Monitors shelled German positions in Belgium, supported landings in the Dardanelles, and returned in the Second World War for fire support at Normandy. They stripped naval warfare down to its most brutal equation: the biggest gun you can float on the cheapest hull you can build. Number 2. A 10 Thunderbolt II, United States, 1977. The Air Force never loved the A-10. It was slow, blunt, and subsonic in an age obsessed with speed. The nose looked like it had been shaped with a hammer. Twin engines sat high and exposed at the rear. The cockpit was wrapped in titanium armor. The aircraft was built around the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon so large that the gun alone weighed thousands of pounds. It looked less like a fighter and more like a flying threat display. Then it went to war. In the Gulf War, A-10s flew thousands of sorties and destroyed hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces across the battlefield. They were built to survive damage that would kill most other aircraft. One engine gone, part of a tail missing, wings peppered with flak, and still flying home. The Air Force tried to retire the A-10 multiple times. Congress kept stopping them because the soldiers on the ground knew what the aircraft was for. The ugliest plane in the inventory was also the one that saved the most lives. Number 1. Liberty Ship, World War II. The Liberty Ship was not a warship at all. It was a cargo vessel, 441 feet long, welded instead of riveted, powered by a single steam engine, and capable of only modest speed. It was designed in 1941 to be built fast and in huge numbers by workers who had never built a ship before. Franklin Roosevelt called them ugly ducklings. The shipyards called them the answer to the U-boat crisis. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships. At peak output, some were completed in weeks or even days. The average was still astonishing, Before they arrived in force, German submarines were sinking Allied cargo faster than it could be replaced. Afterward, the equation changed. Liberty ships carried the food that kept Britain alive, the supplies that reached the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, and the material that made the Normandy invasion possible. They were fragile by design, cracked in cold water, and sometimes broke in half. They were never meant to last long. They did not need to. They just needed to keep sailing. The thread running through all of these machines is simple. Each one was mocked when it appeared. Each one looked wrong to somebody. Each one was built because the alternative was losing. The Kettenkrad moved through mud. The Vespa Tap put a cannon on a scooter. The Catalina saw the enemy first. The Swordfish sank a battleship. The M3 Lee held until the Sherman arrived. The LCT delivered the tanks to the beach. The IL-2 buried the battlefield under numbers. The Monitor floated heavy guns on cheap hulls. The A-10 protected the troops who needed it. The Liberty ship carried everything else. In war, the machine that works beats the machine that looks good every time. That pattern matters because war rarely rewards the prettiest design. It rewards the machine that can be built quickly, maintained under stress, and pushed into a role it was never originally expected to fill. In peacetime, elegance can be a commercial advantage. In wartime, the question is usually simpler. Does it solve the problem before the enemy does? A lot of these machines also owe their success to the fact that they were not trying to do everything. They were brutally narrow. A tanker is not a fighter. A patrol boat is not a battleship. A transport hull is not glamorous. But once a design accepts its limitations, it can devote every pound of weight and every inch of space to the one task that matters. That trade-off is what makes ugly hardware surprisingly hard to beat. The other thing they share is timing. Several of these machines arrived when doctrine had not caught up with reality. Commanders and procurement officers often imagine the next war using the tools of the last one. A strange-looking design can slip through because it solves a problem the current system has not fully admitted exists yet. By the time everyone agrees the problem is real, the ugly machine is already in service. The Kettenkrad is a good place to see that logic in miniature. It was not beautiful because beauty was not the point. German terrain on the Eastern Front destroyed ordinary transport, so the army accepted a machine that looked half motorcycle and half track tractor. Its odd proportions were the price of mobility where roads had become useless. Once you understand that, the design stops being funny and starts being inevitable. The same is true of the Vespa 150 TAP. The scooter was not meant to impress a reviewer. It was meant to move a recoilless rifle and a crew into a battle zone faster than they could walk. Its visual absurdity came from the fact that two unrelated technologies were forced together for a single mission. Yet the result worked because the French needed portability more than they needed dignity. Combat often strips away the luxury of appearance. With the Catalina and the Swordfish, the ugliness was even more revealing. Neither aircraft looked like the future. Both looked like compromises from an earlier age. But the Catalina could stay aloft for long patrols over empty ocean, and the Swordfish could fly slowly enough to defeat the assumptions built into enemy defenses. In both cases, what seemed outdated actually became an advantage. The enemy built tactics for faster, sleeker aircraft, and then had to deal with machines that refused to fight by those rules. The M3 Lee shows another form of wartime ugliness: haste. When an army needs a tank right now, it does not wait for perfect proportions. It takes the gun that is available, puts it on the hull that can be produced, and sends it forward. The high silhouette, the side-mounted main gun, and the riveted construction all reflect urgency more than refinement. Yet urgency is often the hidden architect of military history. The machine that gets there first can matter more than the one that arrives later and looks better. The LCT, the Monitor, and the Liberty ship all share the same industrial honesty. They are not trying to win air shows or inspire admiration from engineers. They are platforms for delivery. A beach needs tanks. A coastline needs shells. An ocean crossing needs cargo. Once you define the mission that narrowly, the design starts to simplify in ways that can make it look unpromising to the casual eye. But simplification is not failure. Sometimes it is the highest form of discipline. The A-10 stands apart only because it survived long enough for the argument about ugliness to become part of its identity. It was mocked not just for appearance, but for refusing to conform to the Air Force's preferred image of speed and altitude. Yet the battlefield kept rewarding exactly the qualities its critics disliked: loiter time, survivability, and a gun designed to smash armored vehicles from close range. The aircraft turned institutional embarrassment into tactical credibility. And Liberty ships remind us that industrial scale can be a weapon in itself. They were not supposed to be elegant, and they were not supposed to survive forever. Their value lay in throughput. If a nation can build enough cargo capacity quickly enough, it can outlast a submarine campaign and keep armies fed, armed, and moving. The Liberty ship may be the purest example on the list because its ugliness is inseparable from its purpose. It was designed as an emergency answer to a crisis of logistics, and it won by being enough, many times over.